Man saves lion trapped in well, and what he did next left everyone speechless. The scorching African sun beat down mercilessly on David Chen's weathered face as he adjusted his wide-brimmed hat and wiped sweat from his brow. After 15 years working as a wildlife photographer across the continent, he thought he'd seen everything. Lions lounging in acacia shade, elephants trumpeting at watering holes, cheetahs streaking across golden grasslands. But nothing had prepared him for what he was about to discover in the remote Kenyan wilderness. David had been tracking a pride of lions for 3 days, hoping to capture the perfect shot for National Geographic. The magazine had commissioned him to document the effects of the prolonged drought on the Masai Mara ecosystem, and he needed something extraordinary to tell the story. His jeep had broken down 20 miles from the nearest village, forcing him to continue on foot with only his camera equipment, a small backpack of supplies, and his satellite phone. The sound hit him first, a deep, guttural roar that seemed to echo from beneath the earth itself. It wasn't the triumphant call of a lion claiming territory or the warning growl of a predator protecting its kill. This was something else entirely, desperate, exhausted, pleading. David froze, his experienced ears trying to pinpoint the source. Following the intermittent roars, he crested a small hill and stopped dead in his tracks. Below him lay the remnants of an old colonial-era farm, long abandoned and reclaimed by the wilderness. Stone foundations jutted from the red earth like broken teeth, and in the center of what must have once been a courtyard stood an ancient stone well. But it was what he saw at the edge of that well that made his heart race. A magnificent male lion, his golden mane matted with mud and desperation etched in his amber eyes, was trapped 15 feet down in the dry well. The big cat's powerful frame, which should have commanded respect across the savannah, now looked pitifully small against the circular stone walls. His massive paws scraped futilely against the smooth stones, worn down by decades of weather and the desperate attempts of previous trapped animals. David's first instinct was to reach for his camera. This was the kind of dramatic wildlife encounter that made careers. The composition was perfect, the ancient stone well, the trapped king of beasts, the desolate landscape stretching endlessly beyond. But as he raised his cannon to his eye, something stopped him. The lion looked up at him, and in that moment, David saw something that shook him to his core. It wasn't fear in those eyes. It wasn't even resignation. It was hope. The lion had been trapped for at least 2 days, based on the claw marks on the stone and the exhausted way he moved. His tongue lolled out, dark and swollen with thirst. The irony wasn't lost on David. Here was nature's most powerful predator, slowly dying of thirst in a well that had once provided life to this forgotten place. David quickly assessed the situation. The well was approximately 12 feet in diameter and 15 feet deep. The stones were fitted together without mortar, colonial-era construction that had somehow withstood decades of weather and neglect. There was no way the lion could climb out on his own. The walls were too smooth and vertical. He could call for help. His satellite phone had enough battery to reach the Kenya Wildlife Service. They would send a helicopter, maybe with sedatives and equipment, but that would take hours, possibly a full day given their remote location. The lion didn't look like he had that long. David set down his camera and began circling the well, looking for options. The old farm had scattered debris everywhere. Rusted metal sheets, broken wooden beams, lengths of rope rotted by time and weather. Most of it was useless, but then he spotted something promising. A coil of rope, relatively new, probably left by researchers or tourists who had visited the ruins. Testing the rope's strength, David estimated it could hold perhaps 400 pounds, far less than a full-grown male lion's weight of 500 to 600 pounds. But it might work if he could somehow convince the lion to cooperate. The next few hours became a delicate dance of trust and desperation. David first lowered his water bottles down to the lion using the rope. The big cat was initially suspicious, backing away from the foreign objects, but thirst eventually overcame caution, and David watched as the lion carefully approached and began to drink. "Easy, boy," David murmured, surprised at the gentleness in his own voice. "Now we're going to figure this out together." As the lion regained some strength from the water, David began the truly dangerous part of his plan. He tied one end of the rope around a sturdy acacia tree that had grown near the well, creating a solid anchor point. The other end would need to be fashioned into a harness of sorts. This was where David's childhood on his grandfather's ranch in Montana came in handy. He'd spent summers learning to rope cattle, and while a lion was decidedly not a cow, the principles were similar. He created a large loop that could potentially fit around the lion's chest and front legs, distributing the weight across the animal's strongest points. The challenge was getting the lion to cooperate. David spent another hour just talking to the big cat, letting his voice become familiar. He lowered more water and eventually some jerky from his emergency supplies. The lion ate ravenously, and David could see intelligence in those amber eyes, a growing understanding that this human was trying to help. "I know this is crazy," David said, his voice echoing in the well, "but we're going to have to trust each other here. You're going to have to let me help you." When David finally lowered the rope harness, the lion's reaction surprised him. Instead of panicking or attacking the rope, the big cat sniffed it carefully, then looked up at David with what could only be described as comprehension. It was as if the lion understood that this strange human was his only chance for survival. Getting the harness positioned correctly took extraordinary patience. David had to lower it repeatedly, guiding it with his voice and gestures until the lion stepped into the loop. The moment when those massive paws settled into the makeshift harness was one of the most terrifying and beautiful things David had ever experienced. "Okay, big guy," David whispered, "this is it." The rescue itself was a testament to both human ingenuity and animal intelligence. David had rigged a pulley system using a broken metal beam, allowing him to multiply his pulling force. But even with the mechanical advantage, lifting a 550-pound lion 15 feet straight up required everything he had. The lion seemed to understand his role in the rescue. Instead of panicking or struggling, he remained as still as possible, occasionally using his powerful legs to push against the well walls when David's pulling aligned with natural handholds in the stone. It took 45 minutes of sustained effort. David's hands were raw and bleeding by the time the lion's massive head appeared at the well's rim. For a moment, man and beast stared at each other, separated by only inches and 15 years of David's assumptions about the relationship between humans and wild animals. Then the lion was out, rolling onto solid ground with a grace that belied his exhaustion. David quickly loosened the rope harness and stepped back, giving the big cat space to recover. He expected the lion to immediately disappear into the bush, returning to the wild where he belonged. What happened next changed everything David thought he knew about wildlife and the invisible connections that bind all living things. The lion didn't run. Instead, he sat down just 10 feet from David, fixing him with those intelligent amber eyes. For several minutes, neither moved. Then the lion did something that would haunt David's dreams and transform his life. He approached. David's every instinct screamed at him to back away, to reach for the flare gun in his pack, to do something to protect himself from 550 pounds of apex predator. But something in the lion's demeanor stopped him. This wasn't stalking behavior. This wasn't aggression. The lion approached slowly, deliberately, until he was close enough that David could feel his breath. Then, in a moment that defied everything David had learned about wild animals, the lion gently pressed his massive head against David's chest. It lasted only seconds, but in that brief contact, David felt something profound pass between them. Gratitude, certainly, but more than that, a recognition of kinship, of shared mortality, of the thin line that separates all living beings from the abyss. Then the lion stepped back, looked into David's eyes one last time, and disappeared into the acacia scrub. David stood by that ancient well for another hour, trying to process what had happened. He had come to Africa to document the impact of drought on wildlife. Instead, he had discovered something far more powerful about the connections that transcend species, about compassion that requires no common language, about courage that emerges when survival depends on trusting someone completely different from yourself. When he finally picked up his camera, David realized he hadn't taken a single photograph of the rescue. He'd been too busy living it, too busy being present for something unprecedented and unrepeatable. He had no proof of what had happened, no dramatic images to sell to magazines, no documentation of his extraordinary encounter. But something had changed in David that day. As he made his way back toward the distant village, he found himself seeing the landscape differently. Each animal track in the dust, each bird call in the acacia trees, each distant roar echoing across the savannah seemed to carry a new meaning. He was no longer just an observer documenting wildlife from behind a camera lens. He had become a participant in something larger than himself. 6 months later, David made a decision that left his colleagues speechless. He sold his expensive camera equipment, liquidated his savings, and purchased 5,000 acres of drought-prone land in the same region where he had met the lion. He established the Mara Springs Wildlife Sanctuary, dedicating his life to creating permanent water sources for animals affected by Kenya's increasingly severe dry seasons. The sanctuary became his obsession. David learned to drill wells, to install solar-powered pumps, to create sustainable watering systems that could support wildlife through the harshest droughts. He partnered with local Maasai communities, hiring guides and rangers, creating economic opportunities that aligned conservation with community needs. But David's vision extended beyond just providing water. He began rescuing animals in crisis, not just large predators, but everything from baby elephants separated from their herds, to injured antelope, to birds with broken wings. The sanctuary became a place where the contract between humans and wildlife was rewritten from one of exploitation to one of mutual care. 3 years after the well rescue, David was checking water levels at one of his remote pumping stations when he heard a familiar sound, the deep, rumbling purr of a male lion. He looked up to see a magnificent cat approaching through the morning mist, and David's breath caught in his throat. It was him. Older now, with scars from territorial battles and the wear of surviving in the wild, but unmistakably the same lion David had pulled from that ancient well. The big cat approached to within 30 feet and sat down, watching David with those intelligent amber eyes. Over the following months, the lion became a regular visitor to the sanctuary. He never came close enough to touch again, but his presence was a constant reminder of the bond that had started everything. David began to notice other lions following the big male to the watering stations, females with cubs, younger males, entire prides learning that this place was safe. Word of David's work spread through the conservation community. Scientists came to study the behavioral changes they observed at Mara Springs. Traditional territorial boundaries seemed less important when water was abundant. Predator-prey relationships were more balanced. Animal stress indicators dropped significantly in the drought seasons. But perhaps most remarkably, the sanctuary became a place where the artificial barrier between human and animal consciousness seemed temporarily suspended. Researchers documented unprecedented examples of cross-species cooperation, of animals exhibiting behaviors that suggested not just intelligence, but empathy. David's story began attracting international attention when a documentary crew arrived to film the sanctuary. They captured footage of the original lion, now old and greying, bringing his pride to drink at David's wells. The documentary showed David working alongside Maasai rangers to rescue a young elephant from a muddy waterhole, demonstrated the sophisticated water distribution system he had built, and interviewed community members whose lives had been transformed by the sanctuary's success. But the most powerful moment in the documentary came when the filmmaker asked David to explain what had driven him to abandon his lucrative photography career to dig wells in the African bush. David was quiet for a long time, staring out across the savannah where dozens of animals were gathering for their evening drink. Finally, he spoke about that day at the ancient well, about looking into the eyes of a trapped lion and recognizing something that transcended species boundaries. "People ask me if I miss photography, if I regret giving up my career," David said, "but they're asking the wrong question. The real question is, how do you walk away once you understand that there's no separation between your survival and the survival of everything else sharing this planet?" The documentary aired on networks around the world, generating millions in donations for the sanctuary and inspiring similar projects across Africa. But for David, the recognition was secondary to the daily miracle of watching life flourish around the water sources he had created. Now, 8 years after that life-changing encounter, David watches the sunrise from his simple hut at the heart of Mara Springs. The old lion still visits occasionally, moving slowly but with dignity, sometimes accompanied by what David assumes are his grown cubs. They never approach closely, but their presence is a daily reminder of the moment when a desperate animal's trust transformed a man's understanding of what it means to be truly alive. The ancient well where it all began has become a pilgrimage site of sorts. David reinforced the stone walls and installed a proper pump, turning it into one of the sanctuary's most reliable water sources. A small plaque beside it reads, "In memory of all the connections we fail to see until survival depends on them." David's transformation from wildlife photographer to sanctuary founder represents something larger than one man's career change. It speaks to the possibility of redefining the relationship between human civilization and the natural world, of recognizing that true security comes not from dominating other species, but from ensuring their survival alongside our own. The lions of Mara Springs now drink from wells that exist because one man chose compassion over career, because he recognized that the eyes looking up at him from that ancient well were not so different from his own. In a world increasingly divided by artificial boundaries between nations, races, religions, species, David's story suggests that our survival might depend on recognizing the connections that bind us all together. As he has learned from 8 years of watching animals gather around his wells, the space between predator and prey, between human and wild, between survival and compassion, is far narrower than we imagine. Sometimes it takes falling into a well to understand that we're all in this together, and sometimes it takes one person willing to throw down a rope to prove that hope, even in the deepest places, is never entirely lost.